Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to have you joining us today. Thank you very much for jumping online this Thursday. Welcome to our RiskWi's online workshop for South Australian growers. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today, which is looking at cropping decisions in a risky environment. Today, we're going to be looking at timing, rotations, nitrogen, and climate. And I'm very pleased to welcome our four speakers who you will see spotlighted on your screen. Barry Mudge from Barry Mudge Consulting, Peter Heyman from the SA Drought Hub, and Stefan Schmidt from Agricultural Consulting and Research, and Sam Trengove from Trengove Consulting. So as far as the day goes today, this online workshop will involve four update presentations plus a series of quick little updates. We're then going to go through our panel session, and we're really excited about bringing this content to you. We're going to look at the time of sowing decisions based on subsoil moisture, and think about what the rain, which some of you may have received, does for our time of sowing decisions. We're going to have a talk about crop selection and rotation options and consider how have farmers' crop selections and rotation decisions shifted after two dry autumns, this season's late summer rainfall, and the current potential fertiliser supply and price issues. We'll also talk about nitrogen decisions, where and which crops should farmers be targeting with their N applications. How should N be applied over the season? Is it better upfront and in season? And we'll also check in on the seasonal outlook. So we're keen to talk about how are you adjusting your program based on the outlook, but also hear from Peter on how we can avoid overreacting to a forecast while still using it to inform better decisions. I'd like to give a shout out to the RiskWi's team. So today's workshop is supported by the National Risk Management Initiative. This initiative really is designed to understand and improve the risk reward outcomes for Australian grain growers by supporting grower on-farm decision making. The GRDC have invested $30 million to support this 5-year national initiative, which runs from 2023 to 2028. A big shout out to the RiskWi's Action Research Group who have put this webinar together. Thank you to the Hart Fieldside Group, Northern Sustainable Soils, Upper North Farming Systems, and the SA Drought Hub for the work they've done in pulling this webinar together. We actually decided we would do it on the Thursday before Easter. So I've managed to pull together the speakers, the questions, and the format for today in a really short amount of time. Being part of this Action Research Network is a really exciting thing. You can see through the RiskWi's Action Research Network, it's one of the largest collaborations between grower groups and research agencies around Australia. So led by CSIRO and GRDC, plus all the farming systems groups, we cover a lot of Australia with our network. And today's workshop's a testament to that networking, that we've actually pulled in a lot of questions, guest speakers, and topics which align with that RiskWi's theme. Some housekeeping for today, please. We ask you to keep your sound muted so we don't get any background noise. Please place any questions in the chat. We'll attempt to answer as many as we can. And we'll also acknowledge that a lot of you put questions into the registrations as they came through. And so I've got them ready to go to fire at the speakers after their snapshot update presentations. And we'll get through as much as we can in the hour. So the format for the day is the speakers will deliver their 4 small snapshot updates, then we'll run our Q&A session. As I mentioned as you were joining, we will be recording the session. We will have the spotlight on the speakers. However, feel free to turn your camera off if you're not comfortable having this on. All right, so I reckon let's get into it. Before we do, just a very friendly reminder that today's session is all about sharing our insights and knowledge as we had them, but a reminder to please follow up with advice afterwards that's specific to your own business. All right, so Our first speaker for our snapshot presentation is Dr. Peter Heyman, who's the SA Drought Hub Deputy Director and also leads SARDI's climate applications team. He's got a 35-year-old career working in science communication, climate applications, and seasonal outlook. And Peter, as well as Barry, work with RiskWi's ARGs. Peter, we're thrilled to have you here. I'm handing over to you with your first slide and 5-minute update. Over to you. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Bill. And so I've got 5 minutes to give a lot of information. This is just the seasonal outlook from the Bureau of Meteorology. It's not a pretty sight in terms of that brownish map for April, May, April to June, May to July. It doesn't go beyond that. So just click the next slide, please. When you click on that little magnifying glass over in the top left-hand corner of, you can then enter, so I've entered Brinkworth here, and I'll be looking at Brinkworth a bit in this really short run through. What that does is for that May to July period, it gives you what the different deciles are. So how many of the computer runs fell in the different deciles. When we see that really brown map, it looks like it can never rain. When you look at that, what's actually being shown there, there is a bias towards more of the runs have ended in the drier deciles and fewer in the wet deciles. But that doesn't mean there's no chance of that. So sometimes we overinterpret the coloring of the map. I think it's a problem, and it's really worthwhile clicking on that magnifying glass. Next slide, please. Obviously, an important aspect for this year is this discussion of El Nino. If you just Google El Nino, there's all these different ideas and concepts about El Nino. But this is based on what you can see there from the American site, where there's a very significant chance that we will have an El Nino this year. That doesn't mean this is early to be saying that, but the modelling there is suggesting that. It is early, but we need to be aware that there is that possible outlook. Next one, please. So the question of, does El Nino affect us? And so here we are looking at across, and this is just a slide from the forecast for profit, and we'll put these sites up for you to be able to access. But you can look at here on the pie charts for spring that have, if they were Mercedes-Benz shape, there'd be equal chance of being in the driest third, the middle third, or the wettest third. You can see La Nina does have an effect, El Nino does have an effect, and it does seem to be remarkably consistent across southeastern Australia. It's really it surprised me when we put this together with our AgVic friends and Federation University, just how consistent this was. Next slide, please. And when we go to the Indian Ocean dipole, a positive Indian dipole even has a slightly greater effect in the part of the world that we're looking at here. Next slide, please. But, and it's a really big but, is that we had this really substantial rainfall, and this is a monthly rainfall for March. This is showing it as a decile range, and you can just see that just how unusual it was. For some areas there, the highest on record. For many areas, very much above average. And remember, there was some rain on the last days of February as well. So that really would have kicked this up even more in some of those northern South Australian grain regions and so on. So we're offsetting the talk of El Nino with this really strong aspect that we've got this stored soil water. Next slide, please. So this is one way to look at it. Okay, so just if you look at Brinkworth there, if we have our profile 30 millimeters full, that's the line there that has the buckets there are 0, 30, 60, and 90 millimeters. It's very rare that we get so wet as that. If we make the sort of peace sign chocolate wheel, the the 30 millimeters. That's getting us some average rainfall over that time. I mean, average starting, and then if we have last year we had no moisture, and so that made the wheel go a lot worse. Only 31% chance of getting above average. As we move towards these wetter conditions, we have 60 to 90%. And then finally, my last slide here. Here we have, if we put El Nino with this. So what this does is this shows that as you add El Nino to this, what we get is we get more red. We decrease the chance of that. What the take home message though is that with a full profile, if you were lucky enough to store 90 millimeters in your soil, to an extent, you're back where you were under the average conditions with 30 millimeters, if that makes sense. So the slide with the 30 millimeters there in the second in the all years one, when we have El Nino there, plus the 90 millimeters of stored soil water, that's where we are. So we were looking initially when we talked to the GODC updates about the chance of El Nino, which is still very, very early to say, that there's this really ugly picture if we have no moisture. It's fantastic. We do have moisture, and we do know we have the moisture to an extent. The El Nino offsets that and brings us back to where we were. So we're sort of balancing those two out. And I think I've used my time, Bill.
Beautiful. Perfect. Thank you very much, Peter, for those insights. I'm going to keep going because we'll ask questions at the end in our panel session. And we're going to move on to our next snapshot update by Barry Mudge from Barry Mudge Consulting. So Barry actually has a 40-year background in practical and technical ag. He has a family farm based in the upper north of South Australia and is also sits on the national project lead for the RiskWi project. I'm keeping our intros very short today in the intro of time, but with all due respect to just showcase how amazing our speakers are. Barry, I'll hand straight over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I am sort of very much wearing two hats, working with the RiskWi project and very much as a farmer as well at Port Germain. And I guess from a farming point of view, today is very, very relevant. We came out of summer, I guess, end of February, two of the driest years prior with no soil moisture. And over the last month or so, things have significantly altered. Obviously, we've had a lot of rain along with the rest of the state, or most of the rest of the state. And also then we've had this war in the Middle East, which has sort of done some interesting things with the commodities or inputs. So I think all the things that we're talking about today are relevant, and all those things have been high on our agenda. And we've made some significant changes. I mean, one of the drivers in this environment very much is soil water and early seeding. We've got the soil water. We've just got to make sure we get the early seeding right. So that's been the focus to what we're doing. I want to just build on Peter's discussion of the El Nino. I've done what I think quite interesting analysis on our situation. If you can go to the next slide, Bill. Canola was totally off the agenda for us to plant canola. We had canola seed sitting in the shed, but at the end of February, when they started to make noises about an El Nino, we had no soil moisture. There's no way in the world we're going to plant canola. And this is why. This is just a really simple, it's the sort of analysis I do quite often. I find it really useful to understand the decision question, the decision choice we have. In this case, this is just what we call gross margin across decile, or profit across decile. Left-hand side, you've got the gross margin, and the x-axis here is just increasingly wet season. So in this case, this is just comprised by a number of individual budgets. So what happens if we get a decile 1? Okay, we'll end up with a negative gross margin. A decile 3, do a separate budget there, separate 5, 7, 9, and then that grey line is just joining the dots between those, joining the dots. And essentially it shows that with no plant available water, and this is based on 120 years of records. So on the right there, I've got the canola yield. This comes out of a really interesting spreadsheet that Peter and his SARDI group, Climate Applications, have done, where we can analyse past records incredibly easily. And so that's the sort of yield spread that I think that our canola gives us with no plant available water. And so you can see that in decile 3 or below, we're going to lose money from the action of planting canola. But if we then look at just the El Nino years, and there's been about 28 of them in the last 120 years, and redo the calculation, you can see how desperately bad it is to grow canola at Port Germain with no soil water. So, okay, so yeah, the immediate reaction there was we're not planting canola. Not that we're saying we're going to get an El Nino, but it's on the card, it's on the possibilities. Let's go to the next slide, Bill. Now, what happens if we add 40 millimetres of plant available water? I hope we've got more than that, but let's say 40 millimetres of plant available water. Obviously, it moves the curves up. And so if you've got 40 millimetres of plant available water all years, we're going to basically be, most of the time, we're going to be getting at least the chance of some sort of result back. And we know how important plant available water is for canola. But even in an El Nino, we've moved up to that next level, I guess, and it's starting to look nowhere near as desperate. But the really interesting thing is the next slide, where we actually put both of those two graphs together, where essentially we're comparing all years, the last 120 years, with no plant available water, compared with an El Nino with 40 millimetres of plant available water. Now, again, I'm not saying we're going to have an El Nino, but essentially the plant available water has removed our immediate fear of the El Nino. Let's hope we're sort of somewhere, we might be somewhere in between the two situations of all years and an El Nino. But I just thought, I found that quite an interesting sort of exercise to do, to firm up our decision choice whether we would plant canola or not. And on that basis, we went ahead and planted canola much earlier than we ever would have done before. But we actually planted canola in March, and it's now up and sort of growing away. So I'll leave it there, Bill, and been excited to talk about a lot of more stuff as we go along.
Perfect. Thanks for those insights, Barry. We'll now move on to Sam Trengove from Trengove Consulting. Sam is an SA Butte-based agronomist and principal of Trengove Consulting. He holds a range of projects and contracts exploring farming systems across the low and medium rainfall zones of South Australia. Sam, I'm going to go straight into your presentation, please.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I was just going to run through a quick example of how the economics of nitrogen decisions might have changed given the recent price increases compared to where we were 6 weeks ago. And so I'm just going to sort of focus on one example here, which is an example from barley and Red Hill back in 2023. But this one example comes from a project we were looking at using protein maps to assess whether we can use them to make better in-paddock decision making. And within that, there's 28 of these trials, and I'm just picking on one. At the end, I'll sort of try and summarize all of those trials together, but I'm just going to run through this one example to start with. So in this paddock here, and in this trial, we were looking at a yield response to a range of nitrogen rates ranging from 0 up to 200 kilos per hectare. And I've deliberately chosen a site that's given us quite a good yield response here. And with 0N, that top graph is showing we're yielding about 3.5 tonne. And when we get a N sort of spot on with about 150 kilos of N per hectare, we can increase that grain yield to about 5.3 tonne per hectare. The graph at the bottom there is taking that yield response curve and converting that into a partial gross margin response curve, where we're looking at urea priced at $800 a tonne, where it was sort of 6 weeks ago, and barley priced where it is about currently at about $280 a tonne. And what that curve shows is that with 0N, our partial gross margin is going to provide us about $1,000 a hectare. And if we get our N spot on in that particular instance, we'll be putting on about 122 kilos of N to get a partial gross margin of about $1,250. So a $250 margin for getting our N right. Can I go to the next slide? And so obviously that's changed in the last month and a half, and we're sort of seeing urea prices, in excess of $1,400 a tonne being quoted at the moment. And so that changes things quite a bit. With urea at $800 a tonne, a break-even yield response in barley at $280 a tonne, we need 6.2 kilos of grain per kilogram of N to break even. When we increase that price to $1,400 a tonne, we need basically 11 kilos of grain per kilo of N to break even. And so now in that graph on the bottom left there, we're looking at the partial gross margin in this same scenario with the same barley price, but increasing that urea price to $1,400. And what the effect is it's changed optimum N rate from 122 kilos of N back to 88 kilos of N, and it's dropped our profit margin. So where we could get $12.50 a hectare if we got N right in the first scenario, if we get it right in the second scenario, we're still only looking at about $1,100, $1,150 sort of dollars per hectare. So our partial gross margins dropped by the order of $100 per hectare. Thanks, Bill. This last scenario is a what if, and it's not. It's a hypothetical that doesn't currently exist, but it's looking at the what if of if grain prices increase by 30%, which I guess we're all optimistic that that might be the case at some point. So we increase our barley grain price from $280 to $364 per tonne. Our break-even yield response now is 8.5 kilos of grain per kilo of N. And you can see the third curve there on that bottom left-hand graph with urea at 1,400 and barley at 364. There's two things. Our optimum N rate increases, but it doesn't increase all the way back up to where it was. So now our optimum N rate with a higher grain price is 106 kilos of N in this example. But overall, the higher grain price means that we're going to be more profitable overall compared to the scenario that existed 6 weeks ago, due to just the greater income derived from that higher grain price. So the next slide. Thank you, Bill. So just to summarise, so this one trial I've just run through, as I said, was one of 28 trials. In that group of 28 trials, there are 11 trials that didn't respond to N. So in those examples where they're unresponsive to N, the price of the N doesn't really change the economics, or only makes them less economic, regardless of the N price. And if we can identify those sites and not put N on them, that's going to be the best decision. On the remaining 17 sites on these Saget trials,
Oh, Sam, I think you've frozen. Okay.
optimum N rate is for each of those
He's back.
scenarios.
Sam, maybe can I get you to turn your camera off? We've got some internet connectivity issues, and just finish those last few sentences. That'd be great.
Yep. The
Thank you.
optimum rate drops to just over half when we increase our urea price to 1,400. This is averaged across 17 trials. And then when we have that higher urea price, but also a higher grain price, the optimum N rate sort of sits in between. I think I'll just leave it at that, Bill. Thanks.
Okay, no worries. Thanks so much, Sam. Some great insights there, which we'll discuss further as we go. Okay, I'd now like to hand over to our final snapshot update from Stefan Schmidt. Stefan is the Principal Consultant for Agricultural Consulting and Research. He's based at Fisherman's Bay. He's also the Executive Officer for Northern Sustainable Soils and has a range of research, trials and extension activities based throughout South Australia. Stefan, over to you, please, and here's your slide.
Thanks, Bill. I'll just run through this really quickly. This just complements the stuff that Sam just talked about. So this slide's just looking at the increase in the cost of production for wheat, barley, canola, and lentils in the medium rainfall zone due to increased fertilizer fuel prices, which is obviously very topical at the moment. So I'll put it together using the Saget Gross Margin Guide, which is a great guide, and thanks to Saget for funding that, with the grain prices based on slightly conservative 5-year averages and the average cost to produce each crop. So what it shows, we've had a pretty significant step up in the cost to produce cereals and canola this year, and to a lesser extent lentils due to fert and fuel. So, fert is just such a huge cost of producing cereals and canola, and with urea going up by 50% and MAP going up, or P-based products roughly going up 15%, it's adding a lot to what it costs to produce these crops. So roughly on average, this is medium rainfall zone. Cereals up around $100 a hectare more to produce. Canola is close to about 125 because obviously there's a high urea component needed in canola, and a lot less change in lentils because obviously we don't top dress and on lentils, so not a huge change to the cost to produce that crop. So probably something we'll talk about later that a few people might be swinging into that. So yeah, and it's largely been driven by fertilizer and fuel prices, with the urea moving from 650 to on a 5-year average to $1,300 a ton, and MAP sitting above its 5-year average at about 1,250 to 1,300. So what that means in practical terms is we now need more yield to cover input costs. So on the far right hand side, you can see in the medium rainfall zone, roughly we need another 300 kilos of wheat or 300 kilos of barley to cover the additional cost of fertilizer. And this isn't factoring in increased cost of herbicides, etc., which we'll probably see starting to unfold now, like some slight increase in that due to increased transport cost. And canola's up around 200 kilos a hectare extra, and little change in lentils, obviously, because we don't top dress with urea, and there's not a big fertilizer component in the cost of production. So main takeaway from this is that the cost of production has increased quite a bit, and our ability to reliably grow more yield hasn't. So we just need to be careful with how we manage risk this year.
Excellent. Thanks very much for those insights. Thank you to all our speakers. Just a few little slides before we move on to our panel session. I'm actually going to hand over to Rebecca to share a Menti platform with you all, but just a very friendly reminder that to always look after your friends, your families, and your neighbours. And we'd like to give a big shout out to the work that iFarmWell do. They've got some great modules about supporting everyone and your well-being in challenging seasons. So thank you to the work that iFarmWell do, but also a reminder to jump online and have a look at these resources. They've just launched a really awesome new campaign called Weather It Together, which has some important messaging about staying connected, focusing on what you can control, getting active, asking for help, and weathering it together. So it's a movement by farmers for farmers, and we encourage you to jump online and use these resources as we go through the season. So we thought we'd share them for you as well. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So we invite you to put some questions in. We're now going to discuss our 4 themes. So time of sowing, crop selection and rotation, and nitrogen decisions. So I'm stopping my sharing. Beck, I'm going to ask you to share a funky little Mentimeter program, and I'm going to ask all of you joining us to jump online or grab your phone, actually, might be the easiest way to do it. Grab your phone, scan the QR code, and I'd like you to let us know what you're thinking at your end. Our first question in the poll is rank the following early sowing risks in order of concern to you. Please place your biggest risk as number 1, and I can see 21 of you have responded now. Let's have a look at how the poll fares. Okay, interesting. So, speaker team, I'm going to get you to take yourselves off of mute, please, because the questions are now coming your way. Well, you got some great questions through from the registration process around this, but here we can see as far as the concerns people are facing, it's running out of moisture later. So Barry, I can see you've got your speaker off. What are some of the considerations we might need to think about with this topic? So making a decision around running out of soil moisture later. What tips have you got for us?
Yeah, look, and it's actually something I was discussing this morning with my son. And it's something that we have seen in the past. perhaps well, we haven't had quite as much soil water as we've got, so that's going to protect us a fair bit. But we're certainly, if we continue to have a favourable crop establishment times, we'll be just dropping the seeding rates back substantially, just to try to stop the biomass of some of the crops, in particular some of the cereal crops, because we're not aiming for huge crops, but at the same time we don't want to compromise them too much. But with such an early seeding, we're going to see substantial tillering. So I guess that's the main thing that we're going to be doing, is trying to reduce just plant numbers, so it can sort of, the crop's incredibly good at working things out. So that would be my only observation. I'd be interested to hear what say Sam or Stefan would think about that.
Start with you, Sam, please.
Yeah, I guess with early sowing, we've got a good bank of moisture up front, and I guess with what Peter showed us before is a bit of a question mark over how the unseason unfolds. We want to try and carry a fair proportion of the moisture that we've got at the moment through the season and be able to use that during grain fill. So we don't want to set the crops up to be chugging through all the moisture in the first 2 months and then leaving nothing for the end. So I sort of agree with Barry's point about sowing rates. We know that with early time of sowing, the crops will tiller and grow more biomass and compensate for a lower plant number, so we can back our seeding rate off slightly. And probably the other thing in some scenarios we can look at is delaying our nitrogen inputs, not loading them up with too much N up front that's going to have them sort of flying too early in the season, but then aiming to put it on in season and sort of, yeah, have a nice even growth throughout the year.
Thank you. I've had 3 questions come through. So I'll invite discussion on this one. Thank you, Kate. And the question is, how does the risk profile alter for a typical crop rotation in each year of your respective regions? Not every crop is grown in equal proportions, so the dollars per hectare comparison doesn't tell the full story. Should we be encouraging a whole farm analysis to get a truer picture? Who'd like to take that one?
I'll just make some observation. I mean, I do a lot of gross margin analysis, whatever. The real difficulty here, of course, is valuing into seasonal effects. You can do a gross margin, but comparing lentils with wheat or something like that, it becomes quite difficult. But I mean, I don't know. I still think just to take from a methodology point of view, just to look. Imagine this future with rigor, put a whole range of possibilities out there, which essentially is saying, I don't know what the season's going to be. I'm going to budget across a range of deciles, if you like, and see what drops out. And I think quite often it's actually quite revealing when you do that, when you take that approach. Because it's such a region specific thing, as I think as was suggested in the observation.
Thanks, Barry. Any other comments from the team? No, we're good. Stefan, I'll get you. I've got a question here from you from Nigel. Thanks, Nige. For Stefan, are the cost differentials between crops enough to change crop choices?
I think certainly for legumes and lentils, like $100 a hectare, or 60 or 70, or you had to grow an extra 300 kilos of cereal to cover the additional fertilizer costs on average, compared to the lentils were an extra 50 kilos. Like, cereals are the higher risk option this year, in my opinion. So, yeah, I'd say that is significant. Yeah.
At the risk of just add something to that, at risk of whatever, Sam mentioned a dropping of around about $100 a hectare when we had that higher urea price, in terms of the optimum gross margin, if you like. I did a similar analysis where I just looked at barley, and a well-producing crop of barley, and I got about the same number, Sam, where across the deciles, loading it up, we're looking at about $100 a tonne. Now, when I compared that with, say, lentils, where they weren't have that same level of depression, lentils came out very favourably against, say, a crop of barley. But obviously, there's a whole heap of rotational considerations around that. But I just support that $100 a hectare number.
Okay, question from Andrew. What should be sown first?
It's
That
a great.
we're
That's a great question. Seeing a lot of rules being broken with canola being sown in March, and I think Sam, we were talking yesterday how, if you use a CSIRO flowering calculator to work out when that canola is going to flower, that's been sown that early, it's going to flower in May in some districts at the end of May, June. So people are obviously pushing canola earlier than probably what is opportunistic. But I've always just thought, obviously canola, and there's scope obviously for lentils as well, more so being interterminate plant than sowing cereals too far into April, because not many people have uh, winter wheat or winter barley varieties yet. So yeah, Sam.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to be too general. Like, really depends on where you are and what your risks are. Uh, Particularly with frost risk, it's going to depend on the varieties that you've got and how quick they are. Like, um, yeah, I guess we're generally biased towards having canola in at the front end of the program. I think most are probably fairly comfortable with that. What comes next is probably typically the next question though. What do I sow next? Um, Probably also depends on how long it takes you to sow the crop and when you actually think the optimum sowing window is for your area. Um, and I guess next question on from that is, when's the optimum sowing window? Do you think you'll still be able to get the crop established during that period? Because for a lot of areas that we're talking about today, the optimum sowing time for cereals is still going to be between the 1st of May and the 10th of May as a rough guide with the varieties that we're typically growing. There'll be some exceptions to that. So there's a question there about how long it takes you to sow the program. How much can you sow within that window? Do you prefer the rest of the program to be earlier than that or later than that? If you're going to go earlier than that, then what is the crop type that's going to perform best in a late April sort of sowing window? And in some cases, I think that's a paddock by paddock question in terms of frost risk and the like. I think in some cases it's not just one crop. You might sow 20% of your wheat, and then you might sow 20% of your lentils, and then 20% of your barley, and then go hard on your wheat at the start of May or something like that. But to give you a general answer for everyone, I'll say it's impossible.
Yeah, just make a quick observation. We had a time of sowing trial for lentils near Port Pirie for about 5 years, and basically it showed that any time after about the 1st of April was okay, which probably surprised a few people. But anyhow, that was the outcome of that, which is a relatively a low frost risk area. But for lentils, yeah, we're really comfortable going from the start of April. Certainly not comfortable going with cereals. Then we want to push through to about at least the middle of April before we go with that with cereals.
Would you say though
okay.
you have to be careful though, because you wouldn't want your whole crop planted that early, because we had that situation a few years back where they were flowering in May, June and setting pods, and you can end up with seed quality issues. Like, you probably want to manage, it's not all just sow them 1st of April, even if you are north, because you can end up with, there's other issues that you expose yourself to, as Sam was alluding to, with frost and whatnot.
Sure.
All right. Thanks. Some great discussion there, Beck. I'll get you to share our next poll question, please, and that'll guide us into our next area of conversation, which is about crop selection and rotation options. Beck, as you're sharing it, oh, there we go. Beautiful. So everyone, grab your phones again. The next one we're keen to get some feedback from you on is, given the early moisture and uncertainty around fertilizer pricing, supply, have you changed your crop mix for this year? So let's have a look at how that lands. And as people are popping their answers in, we've just had another question come through from Nigel, which I'm going to ask just so we maximise all our time with you today. And that was, nearly all the discussions about fert availability and prices have been around N. Are the other nutrients immune to the above two pressures?
I guess no, they're not the only ones The others are not immune, but probably I guess the other major fertilizer input is P, and most of the P supply has already been secured, and a lot of it's on farm or in store. And I don't think the supply issues are a major concern for the phosphate as it has been for urea. That's still sort of inbound. Um, P pricing was already pretty horrible before any of this happened, so uh, that hasn't really changed in the last 6 weeks in response to what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz or anything like that. Um, but in terms of the effect of that high price of P, it has the same effect of, I guess, reducing the optimum rate where you're likely to see a positive return. I guess the other thing with P decisions and the earlier time of sowing is that typically we see with earlier sowing, the response to P declines a bit with better root exploration, warmer soils, and better early P uptake in those scenarios. So there is potentially an opportunity to reduce P rates in that scenario without really reducing your yield potential. But yeah, like I said, most of the P has already been secured and is on farm. So whether you're prepared to carry that till next year or you just prefer to sow what you've got and be done with it.
Thanks, Nigel, for that question, and thanks, Sam. Barry, I might throw over to you. What do you think about the results that have come through from the poll? We've got no major changes, increase in canola area, some more legume crops being planted. Any thoughts on what we're seeing?
Look, I think, Bill, that they are quite good, predictable results. Plant available water is key with canola, so you're not surprised that canola area has gone up, and legumes to try to get a little bit more get away from the nitrogen issue by growing your own. It's a very logical response.
Excellent. Thanks, Barry. So another question which has come through. With input costs where they are and uncertainty about supply, how could farmers be thinking about crop choice differently in 2026 compared to a normal year? We have touched on this already, but any other tips we need to be considering?
Guess there's a conversation there around which crops do I prioritize for nitrogen input? And you can sort of run some numbers on that given what we know about how much N is generally required to produce a ton of wheat versus barley versus canola, and their respective values, and sort of work out where they rank in terms of expected return to that applied N. So why canola is considered a high N use crop with where it's priced at the moment, the return on N, assuming you have the supply of N, is ranks quite well relative to wheat. Even barley at the moment ranks quite well relative to wheat, given the narrow spread in price between wheat and barley. But that's all based on current pricing. If there's a change in that, it changes that dynamic. But perhaps one thing to consider.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting strategic question, and if we have seen a step change in urea pricing, I've got no idea whether we have or not, but just the long-term implication of how do we run a system that'll just allows us to pull more legumes into the system and capture some of our natural nitrogen that way. It's a really interesting strategic question, I think. And something that you can only really run some numbers on to see how things work out.
Okay, thank you. Beck, let's get into the nitrogen decision area. And while you're sharing the next Mentimeter question, we had a question from Bridget, which brings us into this next area. So first up, the poll. In light of uncertainty around N supply and price, what percentage of your normal in-crop N strategy do you plan to apply this year? So have a crack at that one. And while you're answering that, a question from Bridget was, how low can growers go on upfront N without severely compromising yield potential? Who's keen to have a crack at that one?
Anonymous question.
The short answer is it depends, but it helps if you know what your starting N levels are. If you're sitting on a reasonable bank of N, then you can start with 0 N and not compromise your yield potential and um, still achieve yield potential through in-season N application. That's in our environment anyway. I'm talking mid-north YP regions of SA. If you're starting with a very low soil N status, then depending on when you're planning to do your in-season N application, it might pay to have some N up front just to get the crop up and going and get at least tillering or producing a bit of biomass before you can get that in-season application on. I guess we're trying to find the happy medium with N supply where with an earlier time of sowing, we don't want cereals that are going to produce 10 tillers through really high N rates, but on the flip side, we don't want them just sort of sitting there as a main stem with no tillers and being pretty anemic. So we're trying to sort of get a main stem and 2 to 3 tillers, and how much N we need up front is going to depend on what we're starting with in the soil.
Thanks, Sam. Stefan, Barry, any thoughts for you on that one?
I think if you're going to rank crops, you'd rank it canola, barley, and then wheat. You've got a little bit of time to wait. If you can potentially hold up for your N inputs, depending on what your starting N is up until jointing. Whereas like barley, obviously you've got to get it on early, within 6 to 8 weeks of sowing to set up with the tillers because that's what the main driver of yield is in barley. So and canola, you obviously want it on pre-bolting, so you probably got less room to move in canola and barley, but in wheat you've got a chance to maybe hold off a little bit in your inputs and inputs.
Okay, thank you. One for
Sorry,
you.
one other thing, Bill, is depends on the rotation. So paddocks going in on legume stubbles will typically mineralise more N and have more available. Canola or barley going in on wheat or cereal stubbles will generally be hungrier, and those are the ones we'd just backing up what Stefan said would be the ones that we'd be putting early in on.
Thank you. Barry, question in the chat for you, please. If there is a step change in urea cost, is that a tweak to the pulse percent or a major revamp?
I think it's a tweak to the pulse. I've done a bit of just preliminary work in our own system of yeah. So one of the reasons we grow cereals here is to control broadleaf weeds so we can grow more lentils. And we may perhaps have to move to using metros or something like that just to try to keep that broadleaf weed under control, but still have more legumes in the system. So yeah, no, I just think it's and also in some low rainfall environments, it perhaps going back to some sort of a pasture or sow and vetch for a pasture or something like that, because the gross margin on livestock at the moment is pretty good. So there's the whole heap of different tweaks that you can use, but yeah.
Okay, I had two more questions come through in the registration process on the nitrogen decisions. And the first one was, how much N is available in the soils after the last 2 dry seasons? Go on, Sam.
Yeah, sorry, just thinking about the answer. Again, it depends, but depends on inputs and it depends on removal. But assuming that the crops in the last 2 years have still been fed with N, but the crops have been lower yielding, then a percentage of that nitrogen that's been applied will still be there in the soil and available for this year's crop. We've had a nitrogen strategy trial running through the RiskWi project over the last 4 years, and of the N that was applied in 2022 and 2023 prior to the 2024 crop, which was lentils, and then prior to the 2025 crop, which was wheat, we could still measure 10% of that nitrogen in the deep soil N. So for example, if we put 100 kilos of N on it cumulatively in that 2022 and 2023 season, about 10 kilos of that 100 kilos was still measurable in 1 and 2 years after the application. So you may not pick it all up in a deep end, but yeah, certainly some of it will still be there for this year's crop.
Thanks, Sam. And the other one that's come through was what tools or indicators, soil tests, models, rainfall to date, are most influencing your nitrogen decisions this year?
Can I just have a small crack at that? And actually, there's a bit of publicity. There's a new N app that's come out. I think it's in some of the stuff, Bill, that are going to be attached to this.
Yeah, I'll put a QR code in, and we'll also send around some post webinar resources for you to have a look at.
Okay, it's just a wonderful little adaptation that Peter's made to just a methodology of identifying upside and downside associated with nitrogen applications, and this can be done. I won't go into it much, but this can be done on a mobile phone. So essentially, all the information you need is largely held in the farmer's head, and it's just a wonderful little app. I really encourage people to go and have a look at it and use it, and see what they get on with. So that's probably the one that I'm using the most at the moment.
Beautiful. And Shelley, thank you for dropping it in the chat. I'll share a QR code of it afterwards as well. And for everyone that's registered, we'll also drop you an email with a list of resources in. All right, last area we will explore before our webinar ceases for today is on the seasonal outlook. Beck, please share our Mentimeter for the last session. And then I've got some questions which came through in the Rego. And that was, how are you adjusting your program based on the outlook? So there are a number of choices there, which you're increasing risk, chasing upside, maintaining the normal program, reducing risks or inputs, or building flexibility. So stage decisions in. So we'd love to hear from you there. And Barry, from a RiskWi's point of view, maybe some commentary. What do you think? What are you seeing here? Building flexibility seems to be what people are leaning towards, reducing some risk and inputs.
Yeah, and that's very much around the expectation around tactical use of all the nitrogen decisions. Very much can be a tactical decision. So that's what we're talking about there, and then now reducing risk is getting reducing inputs is getting some traction. So I mean, again, these are what we'd expect a rational approach would be. So no, it's all good.
Thank you. Peter, I'm going to throw over to you now. I've had two questions which came through the registration process. One was, how much attention should we pay to the super El Nino forecast that's being reported on? Can we get by on soil moisture?
Really good question. So firstly, about El Nino. This is really early. Take my friends Dale Gray and Graham Anderson make the point. It's a bit like your favorite football team. You know a lot more as you get closer to September than you do now. Be really careful about pre-season discussion about the Crows or what's going to happen with El Nino. So this is early times. The strength of the El Nino and the impact on Australia are not closely linked. It tends to be whether the El Nino develops in the Central Pacific more than anything else. So it's not that. So if you tune out discussion on Super El Nino and Godzilla El Nino and so on, it's basically I think it changes the risks, but let's not get carried away with that. Soil moisture is what buffers us, and this is really rare to have this amount of soil moisture across many areas now, and that is buffering us. In in that way. And so and the good thing about soil moisture is you've got it, rather than people like me banging on about whether we might get an El Nino.
Thanks, Peter. Barry.
Oh, well, I agree entirely. I mean, the soil moisture I just describe soil moisture as gold, a bit like that canola crop behind me. It's just you have it. It can only come out through a plant. It's far more effective. And so yeah, the El Nino will be what it'll be. There's nothing we can do about it other than just be aware of it, and then perhaps pull it into our decision making, our responsive decision making a little bit. But hopefully, as we go making more, perhaps some of these choices further down the track, we may have a little bit more information too.
CD would like to know when you sowed the canola behind you, Barry.
Yeah, no. Okay.
So just on the, I mean, this being responsive as we get closer to top dressing. So Stefan's points about these different windows for canola, for barley, for wheat, and so on. The later you can wait, the more you know about the season. Not only has it already happened, but the forecasts tend to get a bit better. A bit better.
Okay, thank you. Another question that has come through was, what rainfall thresholds meaningfully reduce false break risk across soil types? It's a tough one for the end of the.
It all depends, doesn't it? As Sam says, it all depends. I mean, I think the false break bit is about. I mean, it's about crop establishment. I've always said that it doesn't really. So long as you can get germination, false break. Essentially a false break with not much soil moisture. If you can get crop establishment, it's amazing how those crops will hang on. But at the moment, I would say we're about I don't know 30% through our sowing program. We've been drilling into drying profile. Pretty confident we're going to get the crop up. Now, once we get the crop up, there's no such thing as a false break. It'll do what it'll do. So I think to a very large extent, deep soil moisture, particularly now where it's from the seed bed down, buffers us incredibly well against a false break.
Thanks, Barry.
Just on the false break, one thing we looked at for heart and so on was that last year was a particular year where we got that late April rain and then the driest May on record, and some on heavier soils, some plants died. But as Glenn McDonald pointed out, it's pretty hard to kill little seedlings. It's rare to kill little seedlings, and last year that might have been the case. We've got to be careful about overemphasizing what happened last year, because that was the driest May on record after a bit of a false start in very late April.
And it depends on what you're sowing, Bell. Like, canola being a small seed, like greater chance that it can die under a false break scenario, but cereals and legumes are a little bit more forgiving. So I'm yet to have a client with cereals or legume that's had to resow it when they push the barrier pretty early. And we've had some pretty patchy starts, and obviously 24 and whatnot. So definitely seen thinned out stands and whatnot, but having the crop in earlier in those seasons, even with a thinned out stand, still yielded equivalent or more than waiting for a decent start to the season. But I know we will get a scenario where that may not hold true, but that's just been my observation. Have you ever seen a failure, Sam, apart from your trial at Appler?
No, they can go pretty blue and hang on for a fair while. But yeah, the trial at Appler last year, we managed to create a false break. We sowed lentils at the start of April with a 20 mil irrigation event, and they emerged, and 90% of them died before the season got going. But the ones that we sowed on the 28th of April with the same 20 mil irrigation event managed to survive May and were quite good once it started raining in June. So the risks for that false break, I guess, also need to consider the time of sowing. So the risk if we're sowing last week is greater than if we're starting on the 1st of May, for example, with the same event.
Just a really quick history lesson here. My father, who farmed here at Port Germain for whatever 60 years, said he never once resowed a crop that he'd sown. So he never experienced the need to resow a crop. So history shows that doesn't happen very often.
Okay. So sorry, Peter, you go.
I think Stefan's really good point about canola. I mean, and Kenton Hawker has shown nicely that the temperature for canola with some of this early sown canola doesn't feel like it today. But if we get some really hot days, that's also a factor, isn't it? That we've got to be careful about with some little canola seedlings. Canola is probably the exception to cereals.
Thank you. So we need to wrap up soon. I'm just conscious we're a few minutes over, but there are two more questions which would be great to answer. And then I would just like to finish with a parting word of wisdom from each of our speakers. So a heads up for the speakers, I'm going to get you to give one clear message. Well, if you could give one clear message from the discussion today for farmers to take into 2026, what would it be? So I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm just going to let you have a think about that one. But two very quick questions from the chat, one from Kate. Any thoughts of impact on increasing nitrogen use efficiency using inhibitors? Who can I get to answer that one?
I think the expectation is that the main advantage for the inhibitors is when standard urea is going out in suboptimal conditions. So either well in advance of a front or a front that doesn't eventuate. And if you're going out in those conditions, then there may be an advantage that justifies the cost of the inhibitors. But if you're pretty confident that you can get your N out in good conditions, then it's probably not worth the extra cost.
Okay, thank you. And a final question for Stefan and Barry. Is this year giving you an appetite to give Utrisha in a try?
Did see that comment come through. Yeah, I'm not really sold on it. Maybe Barry is.
No comment. Don't know.
Okay, thank you. All right, so to wrap up our webinar for today, firstly, thank you for all of the questions. If any more come through in the chat, we're happy to follow up and answer them at a different time. But I would like to just hand to each of the speakers, and that was if you had one clear message from the discussion today for farmers to take into 2026, what would it be? Peter, I'll start with you, please.
Better to ignore the forecast than overreact to it. So the real problem would be if people said it's an El Nino, we've got to really pull back too much. That would be a mistake.
Thanks, Peter. Stefan.
It's easy to get pessimistic on cost of production rising, but if grain prices continue to rise like they are, all will be okay, and we won't need that extra bit of yield. It's sort of we just need to hope that that continues to happen.
Thank you, Sam.
I don't know. I feel like we should be optimistic about the season where it's at the moment. We haven't had a break like this in my time of being in the industry, so let's make the most of it. And yeah, have a good year.
Thanks, Sam. And Barry.
Just focus on good agronomy. Good agronomy pays. No expectations. Just focus on what you can control.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll just share my screen one last time, everyone. And here we go. I'm just going to share. Okay, hopefully that's come up. The team, who I'd like to sincerely thank for their time and efforts today, have put together a number of resources which you can draw on. As I mentioned, we'll email these out directly to you, so you've got a copy of them. And also, here's the QR code from the SARDI N app. And you can scan that now, or else again, we will email it through. But on behalf of you all, we're wishing you a very very safe and successful season. We're hoping for rain and good prices. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Hartfield Side Group, Sandy, Upper North Farming Systems Group, Rachel, SA Drought Hub, another Rachel May, and our 4 speakers today. Thank you so much for all of your hard work and effort in putting together today's webinar. Thanks for all of the questions that have come through from the chat. It's a tough topic, but we're doing our best to get information to you in a timely and insightful manner. So I hope you've enjoyed the way we've done the webinar today with some small snapshot presentations, some interactive polls, and then lots of questions and answers. If we can help further, please just send us any emails with any questions in, and we'll get back to the whole team. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us. Look after yourselves, everyone, and use the resources that we send out. Thanks for joining us, and that's the end of the webinar for today.